we know that the gap was bad even before this pandemic. Here in Australia, we know that Australian women end up with about 40% less retirement funds compared to their male peers by the time they get to retirement age. So tell us about your research into how traumatic this has been when it comes to some of the incremental progress that's been made for equality so far.
Well, certainly women remain unequal in the labor force when it comes to earnings. They don't seem to earn the same amount as men, and they don't reach the same quite heights in their career as men do. But one thing we had seen in the United States is women had hit a milestone. In December, they became the majority of job holders. So when we looked at our total jobs in the economy, women held more than men. And that persisted in January and February. And then the pandemic brought that to a crashing end. So they went from holding over 50% of jobs to just over 49% of jobs as the pandemic tended to shut down the jobs that women are most likely to work in. And that's things like education and health services and leisure and hospitality. Those are both majority female occupations, industries, and they got the brunt of the layoffs in those industries.
And of course, that's not taking into account they're also bearing the greatest burdens when it comes to working from home, homeschooling children, not to mention, I guess, just the emotional labour side of things as well, right? I mean, how quickly do you expect this could rebound post-pandemic?
So that's a really good point that you raised. So I have really tried to dig into the data, and this is what I've seen, is that the first problem we see in the data was that women who were in jobs like health services or in low-wage jobs that got sent home, they lost work, and we see real disparities there. But we don't see real disparities among women who have kids versus men who have kids right now. And so I think what we're dealing with is two phenomenon, a short-run phenomenon, which is what happened when we shut the economy down, and we're starting to see some of that reverse. In today's jobs report in the U.S., what we saw was the gap between men and women in terms of unemployment and labor force participation narrowed. So we're getting improvements there, but we're starting to see women really struggling with that caregiving burden that you mentioned. And I think we've yet to see how that's really going to hit their careers, because that's not something that happens overnight. That's slow. That's the kind of thing that's going to make women decide over time that they need to perhaps step down their hours, take some time out of the labor force, pass up a promotion. And I think what we're going to see is a generation of women who really had to slow things down over this year because of their caregiving needs to their children, to their elderly parents, that's going to give them long-run labor market pain.
Exactly. How easy or how challenging is it for women to get back into the workforce once they have to leave because of all of these reasons that you mentioned?
Well, that is, I think, one of the primary challenges is despite the fact that women have really almost as much work experience as men, we still have a labor market where there are plenty of off-ramps from the highway of work, but there aren't very many on-ramps. And so what happens is if you take time out of the labor market, you really have to usually step quite far back in order to get back in, making a lower wage in a less, perhaps, career that in a position that uses your skills less well. And you may even find it's hard to get back in a job that's going to create a path for you to go in the same direction you were going before. So you may get stuck at sort of permanently lower wages. So we need to figure out how to be more flexible as a labor market so that we can reincorporate people who've taken some time out. And that's been a long challenge, and it's one of the reasons why women in the United States do not tend to take very much time out of the labor market after they have a child, because the long-run penalties in terms of their career, in terms of their wages, are so dire that a lot of women try to just work through that, even though we know what's best for children would be if parents took some time at home when they had a newborn.
We have seen some businesses coming to the forefront, like Salesforce, Uber, PepsiCo, offering more flexibility and resources for working parents. They actually signed a pledge. What sort of support are we seeing, not only from the private sector, but also from the government?
Well, the private sector has stepped in where the U.S. government has failed. And some of that's coming from, you mentioned some companies that already sort of offer flexibility. That's what they're actually offering workers. Companies like Uber, where it's not high pay, but lots of flexibility. But we're also seeing it from more highly compensated workers, where employers realized they were just losing too much talent by not creating flexibility for women in particular. And where men started to stand up and say, I need that paternity leave and I need that flexibility. So that's one of the important things we see, is that we do need men to stand up and request the same kinds of family flexibility as women, so that we don't see women getting discriminated against for it. And we see that equal share of that caregiving work in the home. But really, this pandemic's highlighted the failure of the U.S. safety net to really help families manage things like childcare, early childhood education, taking time off for being sick. We've seen problems throughout the country where people have gone to work sick with COVID and spread it across factories and businesses. And that's because there are just so many workers in the United States can't take a single paid sick day.
So here in Australia, Betsy, for example, I think on that same tangent, we've seen the government offer a period of free childcare during the COVID-19 crisis as parents are working from home. Previous to that, it would have been completely not even up for debate for a fiscally conservative government to be giving out free childcare, right? Is this dislocation that we're seeing also a moment for disruption? Should governments be reassessing what they can do when it comes to social and welfare policies? Because clearly it can be done.
Well, I think that governments around the world are starting to realize that childcare is not just a personal issue, not just a family issue, but it's an economic issue for the entire economy. And we need to start thinking about it as a social issue and something that we work together to make sure that people have sufficient childcare, because that's the way we're going to be able to ensure that people can perform at their peak performance in the economy. We have long converted problems like healthcare from a personal problem to a social problem, but childcare has been really, I think, one of the last areas where people just sort of said, well, this is mine to solve. This is not the government's problem. But the truth is that if you are struggling with childcare, somebody else is probably struggling with childcare. So collectively, we have a problem. And when you're struggling with it, you're not going to be able to do the kind of performance that you want to do at work, to be able to achieve what you want to be able to achieve. And that holds the entire economy back. So I do think, a silver lining coming out of this is hopefully a greater recognition across the political spectrum that childcare is not a women's issue, it's not a family issue, it's an economic issue.